Inside the car, the heat of his body blended with the thick, warm air of the sultry night. The vehicle's interior seemed smaller, as if the very space around us were slowly closing in, pushing us towards each other. The darkness outside made everything feel even more intimate, as if the world beyond no longer existed, as if only our bodies and the moments ahead remained. The scent of grease embedded in his skin, mixed with sweat and the faint trace of a cologne that seemed to have become a part of him, made everything even more intense. There, in that confined space, every detail was amplified, every sensation heightened. He pulled me closer, his rough fingers tracing a slow path over my skin, leaving behind a trail of warmth as if he wanted to etch that moment into me. His touch wasn't rushed. There was no frantic urgency. It was a deliberate movement, charged with intent as if we wanted to preserve every second in our memory. I'll tell you how it all began. The first time I saw Ethan was purely by chance, one of those fortuitous encounters that seem insignificant at the moment, but later turn out to have changed everything. My car, which had been running perfectly until then, suddenly started making a strange noise in the middle of the road, a dry, repetitive sound that made me frown and look with a certain urgency for the nearest mechanic. The closest garage wasn't part of a well-known chain, nor did it have any flashy signs. It was a small workshop, tucked away at the end of a cobbled street where the old building seemed frozen in time. A rusty metal sign suggested the place had been there for years, perhaps decades, but contrary to what I had imagined, the space inside was surprisingly organized, with tools neatly arranged on shelves and the floor clean, without the expected oil stains. That was when he appeared. Ethan emerged from behind a car with its bonnet open, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. His overalls were unbuttoned down to his chest, revealing tanned, sweaty skin, marked by firm muscles and the sheen of someone who had been working hard under the heat. His slightly disheveled hair hinted at how long he had already been there that morning. His gaze was direct, firm, but there was no arrogance, just an intense presence that didn't need permission to be noticed. "Problem?" he asked bluntly, his voice practical, wasting no time on unnecessary pleasantries. I swallowed dryly, trying to appear as composed as possible. "A strange noise in the engine," I replied, keeping my expression neutral. I had never been the type to be easily intimidated, but there was something about him that made me hesitate for just a second longer than necessary. He nodded silently and gestured for me to start the car. I obeyed, watching as he leaned over the engine, his agile fingers moving between the components with an impressive familiarity. He didn't just seem to repair cars. He seemed to understand them, to feel every vibration, every noise as if they were speaking to him in some silent language. It was as if he belonged in that world of tools and metal, as if he were as connected to it as he was to his own body. And from that day on, something in me changed. I began using my car as an excuse to return. Small issues, unnecessary checkups, any reason would do. I knew I could go to any other garage, find any other mechanic to do the job, but I always ended up there, standing in front of that small workshop at the end of the street. And every time I arrived, Ethan was there, bent over an engine, his brow furrowed in concentration, his fingers dark with grease, his face marked by the effort. Over time, what had once been quick interactions about mechanical issues turned into something more. At first, we only talked about cars, exchanging technical information and maintenance tips. But then, without realizing it, we started talking about other things. About football, about classic rock bands, about the trips we dreamed of taking, about life. And that was when I started to notice the subtleties. The way he looked at me over the bonnet, his eyes lingering just a little longer than necessary. The way he smirked slightly, discreet but loaded with something I couldn't quite define. The extra time he took before handing me back the car, as if he was looking for reasons to keep me there a little longer. There was something between us, something unspoken, but present, something that didn't need words to exist. After that day, our relationship continued to grow. There was no rush, just a silent understanding that deepened with time. We sometimes met outside the garage, sitting on the pavement after work, drinking beer and talking about anything and everything. But the glances were always more intense, the gestures closer. One night after closing the garage, he offered to give me a lift. His car was old but well-maintained, and the scent of grease mixed with the faint trace of his cologne made me feel something I tried not to name. "Do you want to stop anywhere?" he asked, steering with one hand while the other rested on the gear stick. "Here's fine," I replied, not needing anything more than his presence. He parked and remained silent for a few seconds. The engine was off, the night was warm, and the city outside was asleep. I turned to him at the same moment he was already looking at me. "What are you waiting for?" I asked, not needing to say anything more. If you're enjoying the story so far, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing more stories like this. Your subscription helps the channel grow and motivates us to bring even more stories that will captivate you. Let's continue the story. The air inside the car felt heavier, thick with everything that had been building between us. He leaned in, his hand sliding firmly but unhurriedly to the back of my neck. His touch was warm, stained with grease, but nothing could have felt more right. Inside the car, the heat of his body blended with the thick, warm air of the sultry night. The vehicle's interior seemed smaller, as if the very space around us were slowly closing in, pushing us towards each other. The darkness outside made everything feel even more intimate, as if the world beyond no longer existed, as if only our bodies and the moments ahead remained. The first touch was subtle, a hesitant brush, almost a test, as if we were waiting for silent permission from one another to move forward. My senses were sharpened, absorbing every detail. The scent of grease embedded in his skin, mixed with sweat and the faint trace of a cologne that seemed to have become a part of him, made everything even more intense. There, in that confined space, every detail was amplified, every sensation heightened. He pulled me closer, his rough fingers tracing a slow path over my skin, leaving behind a trail of warmth, as if he wanted to carve that moment into me. His touch wasn't rushed. There was no frantic urgency. It was a deliberate movement, charged with intent, as if we wanted to preserve every second in our memory, as if we were recording everything to never forget. Our ragged breaths filled the space between us, creating a rhythm of their own, a melody only the two of us could hear and understand. Sweat trickled slowly, forming small trails over heated skin. His body was solid against mine, warm, firm, so close that I could feel the rapid thudding of his heart. The desire was almost tangible, an invisible weight growing between us with every moment, with every silent look exchanged in the dark. And when everything finally happened, it was without words, without the need for explanations, without promises spoken aloud. It was something beyond the physical, beyond the mere act. It felt as if we had been destined for that moment, as if every choice leading up to it had inevitably brought us here. Just us, the endless night, the stifling heat, and the certainty that none of this would end when the sun rose again. Time dissolved around us, lost its meaning, ceased to exist. We moved without thinking, guided only by instinct and the unspoken understanding of what this meant. There was no need to speak, no need to fill the space with empty words. What existed between us was deeper than anything words could ever express. Inside that old car, beneath the dark sky and without witnesses, every movement felt natural, as if we had been waiting for this moment for a long time, perhaps forever. His touch was firm yet careful, a perfect balance between desire and tenderness, as if he knew exactly how far he could go without breaking the magic of that instant. Our bodies fit together effortlessly, like the perfectly aligned gears of an engine, as if we were meant to function together. The warmth of the night wrapped around everything, intensifying the atmosphere even more. Suppressed sighs blended with the silence, creating a quiet complicity, an unspoken conversation between us. Every glance, every shared breath carried its own meaning, an unspoken understanding that this wasn't just about desire, that this wasn't merely a fleeting moment. It wasn't about urgency or haste. It was something greater, a feeling built in small moments, in exchanged glances that spoke louder than words, in touches that lingered just a second longer than necessary. When it finally happened, it wasn't just physical. It was the silent confirmation of something we had already known, but had never spoken aloud. The certainty that this wouldn't end there. The certainty that something greater bound us together. Something that didn't need a name. Something that simply existed. As dawn broke, the golden light of the sun began filtering through the gaps in the windows, casting soft reflections across the car's interior. The air still carried the remnants of the previous night, the heat of our bodies, the mingled scent of sweat and cologne, the almost tangible sensation of what had happened there. He was still there. He hadn't left, hadn't slipped away in the quiet of the night, and that alone said more than any words ever could. His eyes, still heavy with sleep, found mine in the gentle silence of the awakening morning. No explanation was needed, no good morning, no rehearsed phrases, just that deep gaze, filled with unspoken meanings. He smiled, A small, almost imperceptible smile, but it was enough to warm something inside me. A simple gesture yet laden with silent promises. My heart responded with a light squeeze, a delicate certainty settling between us. It wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, even if undefined. Even if no promises were spoken aloud. The moment didn't need labels or complicated explanations. It simply existed, pure and untouched. And the world outside carried on, indifferent to what had happened inside that car, but for us, time remained suspended, allowing us to hold on to that feeling just a little longer, that quiet certainty that something new had begun.
Comment below what you would do in their place. Would you fight it, hide your desires, or give in completely? If you enjoyed it, like and share when no one is looking. And don't forget, betrayal is not subscribing to the channel.